This is meeting 34 of the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. For those in person, please remember to follow health and safety guidelines as per the cards on the table to prevent audio or feedback incidents. Just a reminder to committee members and to witnesses, you don't need to worry about pressing the button on your microphone. It will turn red when you begin to speak. You don't have to fuss with that. The clerk has distributed a list of organizations who have requested the blues as per discussion at last meeting. And it's at committee discretion, as we discussed, on how narrowly or widely we distribute these blues. And the previous chair had decided that it was a narrow distribution, but I'd like us to actually go to a vote on whether we make the blues more easily accessible and transparent to everyone that is requesting it. Is there language I have to say specific, Mr. Clerk, on that for the vote?
As long as it's understood by the committee. I mean, if members want.
So the motion that we're voting on is to give access to the blues upon request. Does anyone have any questions or concerns before we do the vote? So all those in favor to provide access? Oh, est-ce que vous avez une question, Monsieur Bonnet?
Ben oui, certainement. Merci.
Do you have a question? Yes, I do. Thank you, Chair.
Bien compris la.
I haven't really understood the reasoning behind this request and whether it's going to add anything, given that transcripts are available. I'm wondering whether it might be a good idea for some lobby groups that have a lot of money. And so this is a decision that might be accompanied by certain risks and require changes. And the justification isn't clear for me. Why do we need to make this change at this time?
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Mr. Bonnet?
2 semaines.
It takes about 2 weeks to produce the transcript, to make it available to the public, whereas the blues are ready within 48 hours after the adjournment of the meeting. And this is why a number of industries are asking for access to them. So it's not a justification. It is up to the members of the committee to justify yes or no whether they're going to accept this request, but that's the explanation. Thank you.
Les vidéos sont évidemment disponibles.
But the videos are available. Yes.
All those in favor of making the blues available upon request more broadly?
So that's
and including online. And those against?
9.
Okay, merci. We are going to make that change. 2 other quick matters of announcements before we begin with our witnesses today. I have sent a letter to the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer requesting that the 2023 report on the energy sector and agriculture be updated. The House has not yet ratified a nomination for the appointment of a new Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the committee's request will be promptly brought to the attention of the Parliamentary Budget Officer once an appointment is made. And then further to the motion adopted by this committee on April 14th, the Major Projects Office and Don Farrell have been requested to appear before other committees on April 28th. This is not within our control, but we are working to schedule Ms. Farrell in, and we are currently looking at the 28th being freshwater because no one was available the 28th, and then the 30th and the 5th, hopefully working for ECCC, Secretary of State for Nature, Parks Canada Agency, Ms. Farrell, Simon Donner, and Catherine Abreu. So the clerk has been hard at work trying to get all of those fitting on the 30th and the 5th, but it's still a little bit of a question mark. If we have to go out another week to schedule it in, we will, but we should get final confirmation tomorrow, and then we will share that with committee once we do. So I'd like to welcome the witnesses that we have here today. In person, we have Caroline Brouillette, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. And online, we have Mr. Jim Keating, the Chief Executive Officer of the Oil and Gas Corporation of Newfoundland and Labrador. Witnesses, you will each have 5 minutes to provide opening remarks, and then we will go to questions by committee members. I do have a little timer, if it's helpful, to give you a 1-minute notice, and then when your time is up, please finish up as quickly as possible. And Madame Brouillette, we will begin with you. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, thank you for having me. I will alternate between the two official languages during my remarks. I represent Climate Action Network Canada, which brings together nearly 200 trade unions, development, faith-based, Indigenous, and the country's leading environmental organizations working in the area of climate change. Our organization and its members have been working for years to ensure that the largest polluters in the Canadian economy are held responsible and pay the cost that they impose on all of our society.
Week makes clear that climate progress has stalled. Oil and gas emissions continue to rise while other sectors like electricity are decreasing their impact. And since key measures have been weakened, paused, or set aside during the past year, progress towards the 2030 and 2035 targets, as well as the net zero by 2050 commitment, will now depend even more on the strength and credibility of Canada's industrial carbon pricing. So will our ability to maintain competitiveness in a global economy that is rapidly accelerating the adoption of net zero technologies. This matters. It matters for Canadian workers, consumers, and industries, especially given the complex times that we find ourselves in. It's been quite troubling to note that some witnesses to this committee have either failed to understand how industrial carbon pricing systems work or have amplified common misinformation. Industrial carbon pricing does not increase household costs. Unlike the consumer carbon levy, industrial pricing does not affect the price of fuel used by households and has very little pass-through to other household purchases or services. Analysis by the Canadian Climate Institute shows that the impact of the industrial carbon price on the average household out to 2030 is negligible. The policy likewise has minimal impact on the agricultural sector. This marginal impact, however, is completely overshadowed by the far more significant effect of inflation driven by war, driven by climate change, and by the Canadian economy's overdependence on fossil fuels, whether as consumer or producer. The surge in global prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as the shock caused by the US and Israeli war on Iran, illustrate the consequences of this overdependence. As climate change accelerates, food prices are increasingly being affected by extreme weather events, drought, and unfavorable growing conditions. All of these have inflationary impacts on Canadians. For instance, the Centre for Future Work has found that from 2022 to 2024, the cumulative direct and indirect costs caused by fossil fuel-driven inflation totaled roughly $12,000 of inflation per household. Yet despite all of this evidence, in its efforts to eviscerate climate policy in this country, the oil and gas industry and their supporters have been promoting the idea that the trajectory of industrial carbon pricing will lead to an additional $20 per barrel in 2030. The Canadian Climate Institute has calculated the real compliance cost from oil sand facilities using data published by Alberta. And they find that the effective average cost across all facilities falls closer to 50 cents per barrel in 2030. Considering that if fuel prices remain at current levels, Canadian oil and gas companies are projected to rake in profits of $90 billion from the Iran war, I am sincerely struggling to find words to respond to the suggestion that they can't afford to pay the cost of a Timbit per barrel. Près d'un an après l'élection du...
Nearly a year after the election of the new government, our organization and its members are beginning to grow impatient as they wait for the Carney administration to show its hand on this policy. It's high time for this government to demonstrate its resolve to the many voters who cast a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister's climate credibility and who are now wondering what has becoming of that enthusiasm. At this stage, Climate Action Network Canada and its members are ready for our industrial carbon pricing system to be updated. And we're waiting for you. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
We will now go to Mr. Keating online for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for your kind invitation. As the CEO of a Crown corporation, I sit in a magic spot between the investor, one who participates on a commercial basis in this industry, and on the other side, I represent the people, the government, and I look for maximum economic rent extraction and hope to strike a balance for the benefit of the sector and those within it. But what brings me here is to note that it's very striking that across the global competitive landscape for
traduction, elle est comme double. Donc, il y a deux voies de traduction, une par-dessus l'autre en français.
We should dig in on that. We'll pause for just a moment, Mr. Keating.
landscape for offshore exploration investment, Canada and specifically Newfoundland and Labrador, and soon I hope Nova Scotia with its license rounds, we stand almost alone in applying a carbon price to a resource that we collectively and overwhelmingly export and rely on for economic security. If we look at our comparators, we find only a narrow subset of OECD countries, namely Norway, the UK, and Australia, in a similar situation. But this comparison quickly breaks down. The UK has effectively stepped away from exploration, is no longer a meaningful competitor. And Australia's system, introduced recently in 2023, is largely oriented towards LNG and natural gas. But meanwhile, jurisdictions that are most active and most successful in attracting offshore oil exploration, namely the United States, Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Namibia, Malaysia, India, and Indonesia, apply no carbon price at all. So the question becomes, how do we remain competitive in that environment? But to answer that, it's worth looking a little closely at Norway. If you want to understand effective energy policy, Norway is one of the few places to study it seriously. is not perfect by any means, but it's built a durable model, one that maximizes the long-term value of its natural resources while maintaining a strong environmental and societal support. It is a model that Canada should be learning from and not ignoring. Norway's carbon pricing system is particularly relevant because it applies directly to upstream oil and gas, as it does here. Norway uses two overlapping mechanisms, a CO2 tax in place since 1991 and participation in the EU emissions trading system. These apply directly to offshore fuel, combustion flaring, diesel use, gas turbines, and so on, and are charged on a per ton basis of CO2 emitted. The resulting cost is amongst the highest in the world, often in the range of $80 to $150 US per ton. But here's a crucial point. These costs are treated as operating expenses and are deductible within Norway's petroleum system. With a marginal tax rate of 78%, the state effectively shares a large part of that carbon cost. So yes, the carbon price is real and significant, but so is the fiscal offset. The result is that Norwegian producers face a meaningful and predictable carbon cost, particularly in operations, but within a system that has been deliberately designed to preserve investment attractiveness. But at first glance, Norway appears contradictory. High carbon prices alongside strong exploration activity. And by comparison, Norway had 50 exploration wells last year, offshore Canada, 0. But this is not by accident, it is by design. Norway operates two parallel policy tracks serving different objectives. It seeks to de-risk the front end on investment, but discipline the back end on operations. With regards to the front end, Norway aggressively reduces exploration risks at 78% marginal tax paired with refunds of approximately 78% of exploration costs, with the immediate expensing and investing of incentives. If a well is dry, companies recover most of those costs, and if it's successful, of course, they retain meaningful upside. Critically, new entrants, even those with no taxable income in Norway, receive cash refunds from the government in the next fiscal year. This dramatically lowers the risk-adjusted cost of exploration and keeps drilling activity strong, even for smaller players. In the back end, once production begins, the system now tightens. Hydrocarbon pricing applies to all oil production from the very first ton. Combined CO2 tax and EU ETS exposure, plus strong incentives provide strong incentives for electrification, efficiency, and low emissions design. So in other words, Norway does not discourage exploration, it shapes it. Carbon pricing does not suppress investment, it disciplines how projects are developed and operated. It creates a culture of investment in Norway. So the result, Norway continues to attract significant exploration investments, not despite its carbon pricing system, but alongside it, because the exploration risk is materially reduced, the carbon regime is predictable and fully integrated into project economics, and the overall fiscal system delivers competitive risk-adjusted returns. High carbon prices alone would deter investment, but Norway does not rely on carbon pricing alone. It deploys a complete and balanced system. Canada, by contrast, appears largely indifferent to investment attraction. Our approach is fragmented. We focus heavily on regulation and taxing existing production, the back end of the value chain, while paying insufficient attention to the front end. Thank you.
Now go to questions from committee members. We will begin with Ms. Anstey for 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Keating, for the great work that you do for Newfoundland and Labrador and for appearing again on this committee and for this important discussion. Mr. Keating, I just want to dig into some of the points that you've raised. Most importantly, we've just struck a deal on the offshore, a milestone agreement with Equinor and BP to advance the Bay du Nord project. And this would be Equinor's very first operatorship offshore Canada and BP's first production. I want to ask you, and I also want to frame this question with respect to where we've been over the last number of years and where we are now, but how important are new international investors to Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore?
New investors are of paramountcy. We are not like, say, Western Canada, where largely all the good acreage is taken and subscribed. We are only 7 or 8% subscribed in terms of the available offshore license area. So we very much depend on the entry of new companies like Equinor and BP to make sure our industry continues and flourishes.
And just for a more fulsome picture of that, can you just, for the benefit of the committee, can you describe where we've been from an investment perspective in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador on our offshore over the last number of years and when you've gone out for rounds of investment?
Yes, we have a tale of two solitudes. Between 2013 and 2018, we had a fairly significant level of interest. We had over 14 companies bid over $4 billion of work commitments in over 20 exploration licenses. Unfortunately, COVID induced, and then subsequently, I'd say a layering of regulatory policy on an uncertainty on top of that. We now, in the last 3 years, have received 0 bids for the first time in our 50-year history, and 0 exploration wells for the first time in our 50-year history.
So what does that mean for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador when these sorts of things happen in an environment that is an economic environment that's extremely dependent on this industry?
Oil and gas is the lifeblood of all industries. 23 to 26% of GDP on average in the last several years, and basic government revenue almost the same amount. It is larger than the next 6 industrial sectors combined. So as it goes, the province goes. So with great excitement, we built expectations on this new project called Beta Nor, but there's much more out there, many more projects like Beta Nor just waiting to be discovered. And it's my job, of course, to make sure that that happens.
Great segue to my next question. So when you're looking for the investment, and when these investors are looking at our industry and they're looking at Canada, how do they encounter this price on carbon? You've talked about other countries. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yes, well, very much we're an outlier. So for the first instance, we have to kind of characterize that. Those that are familiar with Norway will kind of quickly understand that this is part of another economic rent. But unlike Norway, and like I said, there's no equal and opposite offset to balance that risk. So it's simply has to be modeled. And what they don't understand and they don't appreciate are the nuances and the complexity in the systems that exist here in Canada. So what they end up doing is modeling the worst case outcome. So not 50 cents as I've heard it before, but it may go as high as $2.50, which on a $60 a barrel, when $45 is your target price, it starts to become meaningful.
And would you agree that it's not just the price, but it's also the complexity?
Very much so. The complexity is of great concern. This is a program in Canada that was first discussed in 2017, initiated in 2019, was reviewed in 2022, modified again in 2023, and now we're talking about it today in 26. With more discussions to be had in 27 and 28. So it's a constantly moving target and topic, and it is more than an irritant. It is something that needs to be managed. And when you have had no investment and no activity, that's just one further obstacle in our way.
Sorry, and just for the benefit of people who may not be who don't understand the offshore industry as well, can you explain how the complexities and the time frames really impact this industry uniquely when we're talking about the development?
Oh, sure thing. So our offshore oil projects are almost as long life as the oil sands, 25 to 35 year trajectories are common. So companies must need to model that and understand what their trade-offs are. With a carbon pricing mechanism, you have an escalating price per ton, but you also have a diminishing floor of let's say a cap, which is this tax is not applied. So they are divergent. And unfortunately, as the oil projects age, the emissions intensity does worsen over time. So that adds a level of complexity that needs to be reckoned.
We will now move to Mr. Grant for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. And it's a pleasure to see you again, Ms. Brouillette. And I wanted to touch on the joint letter that Climate Action Network jointly signed to the Prime Minister earlier this year, I believe in March, where you said that industrial carbon pricing is widely agreed to be the most efficient road to industrial decarbonization. Could you further explain what you mean to the committee when you say efficient, and what do you mean by that?
And yes, a group of CANRAC member organizations, including the David Suzuki Foundation, the Pembina Institute, West Coast Environmental Law, the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, recently submitted that letter to the committee as well with our recommendations. It's been modeled that the industrial carbon pricing could be the tool in our policy toolbox right now that drives the largest share of emissions reductions in Canada, which is why we're very impatient to see the government move forward with it. The efficiency argument is also, from an economic perspective, in terms of the marginal cost of reductions happening first, and yeah, that's what we mean by efficiency, is that investors and companies will be investing first in those emissions that are lower cost and increasing the investments in those that are higher over time.
Thank you. There's a concern we often hear that in pricing industrial emissions in Canada just pushes production and investment to countries where there's no carbon price without actually reducing global emissions. Can you walk the committee through why a well-designed output-based system like OBPS addresses that concern?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the world is increasingly shifting to electric and zero emissions based technologies. And so for our industries, our workers, our markets to remain competitive, we have to make sure that our economy is incentivized to move into those sectors where the world is moving. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that major jurisdictions, including markets like the European Union and China, that Canada is seeking to diversify to, especially in this context, as we're seeking to loosen our dependence on exports to the United States, have policies in place that either take into account emissions, like the EU's upcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism, or have pricing mechanisms in place. There are approximately 14 individual countries, excluding the EU's regional system, that have emissions trading systems that are comparable to Canada's OBPS. So really important, if we want to compete, that the government incentivize our industries to reduce emissions.
And how do industrial carbon pricing support investment certainty for clean energy and decarbonization projects in the country?
I didn't hear that.
Sorry. How does industrial carbon pricing support investment certainty to clean energy and decarbonization projects?
Well, an industrial carbon price basically forces companies to internalize the cost of their pollution. It's a polluter pay mechanism. So right now, these sectors, and in particular the largest polluting sectors of the Canadian economy, namely the oil and gas sector, which accounts for over a third of our national emissions, are often not fully paying the cost, the social cost of carbon that is imposed on Canadians, but also on the world because of this pollution. And so forcing these companies to price that out in their investments will mean that they will prioritize technologies that are less polluting over time, and that if we look at the bigger macro picture, the Canadian economy and specific sectors of the economy will grow where there are less emissions and where there's compatibility with not only that competitive outlook that we were describing earlier, but also in terms of a healthy environment, and which is better for people and planet.
And can you further speak to what it would cost industry in Canada's competitive position if we didn't have industrial carbon pricing?
I actually don't have that data with me, but would be happy to submit it in writing.
I'll just go back to the OBPS then, and how does the way the OBPS is structured help keep production here while still creating an incentive to reduce emissions? Oh, sorry.
By ensuring that our products and our industries are investing in sectors of the economy where emissions are progressively reducing so that we can compete in a global market that's shifting towards net zero.
Thank you.
Maintenant, Monsieur Bonin, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We were talking about Baie du Nord a little while ago, Madame Bruyat. Do you consider that it's normal that the government wants to do tarification for and reinforce industrial carbon pricing, but continues to give Baie du Nord and commitments? They talked about giving them $1 billion for their oil gases as in terms of subsidies. Do you think that this is coherent in terms of policy? No, I don't. So what do you propose? A carbon tarification, but we should take away subsidies? Well, it is our demand. We want to reduce and eliminate all subsidies to fossil energy. The climate crisis is because of oil and gas, and it's nice to invest in new sectors and to give financial incentives in order for them to reduce their emissions progressively, as well as all sectors. But we also have to stop promoting through subsidies to fossil fuels in order to increase our production of oil and gas. The first step is that we have to stop or reduce production, and these kinds of subsidies do the exact opposite. In the Globe and Mail today, there was an agreement, there was an article about the Alberta-Canada agreement, and the GHG gases was taken away, and also expansion of the Trans Mountain project and increase of $1 billion barrels. And the government also said we're going to do carbon tarification. We're going to reinforce it. So we're going to give billions to oil and gas to sequester carbon. So do you think that this approach and this agreement with Alberta is responsible when we consider the climate crisis? Well, I'm really worried. Especially when I see that the calendar date of, the April 1st is gone. Alberta hasn't talked about its commitments on certain key elements on the climate policy that had been discussed in the famous MOU. And what really worries me is that there might be further public investments in the pipeline, especially when we think about the financial catastrophe that it was for taxpayers, $50 billion that were put into the Trans Mountain pipeline. Can we really afford to continue to play in this kind of situation? I think it's very worrisome. You mentioned the profits made by oil and gas companies, $90 billion. How much of those profits are attributable to the Iran war, for instance, and compared to what we'd see normally? Well, with the actual prices, if fuel prices maintain themselves right now, before the war, it was going to go into the 30 billion in profits, but now it's tripled because of the devastating war that is happening. And so many of our members are saying how important it is for the government to tax these excessive profits and reinvest them in measures to help Canadians who are facing huge energy increases and impact us directly in our wallets, whether it's prices for gas or heating for the homes. We need to deal with this inequity and describe the reality that we are facing. We're talking here about putting a pause on fuel surcharges, fuel taxes, but who in fact is benefiting from this situation? So what you're saying is those industries have a way of dealing with carbon tarification. Well, I think that when we're thinking that they're making $90 billion in profits, and the industrial carbon would be costing a whole 10 bit, I'm really having a hard time thinking that they can't afford it. You talked about a letter where you made recommendations, where you reinforce industrial carbon tarification. Yes, but we also talk about the importance of maintaining certainty, like they did in Norway, to incentivize investments. So the first thing in English is to assure themselves that the minimal price is strong and increases progressively, and that takes a post to 2030 credible trajectory. We know that we're looking at 170 per ton, but what happens between now and 2050 is very important to get that certainty.
Implement the federal backstop in provincial jurisdictions, and right now it's not doing that. Fourthly, we need to ensure the effective price signal is not undermined by loopholes that permit offsets and emissions reductions accounts. And finally, improving transparency and durability of the carbon price signal is key.
Okay, merci, Monsieur Bonin. We will return to Ms. Anstey for 5 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Keating. I just kind of want to pick up on our conversation that we were just having. We often hear lots about, the profits to the oil and gas companies, but we don't often talk about the royalties to provinces. Can you explain, for the benefit of the committee, what the impact is to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, the offshore sector, and the royalties that get paid to the province?
Yeah, sure, certainly. The fiscal system in Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore is fairly consistent between all the projects. It's a progressive royalty system, which means it grows over time as profitability increases. And at any particular time, as much as between 20 and 45% of every profit dollar flows through to the province. It generally means today in say 2025, last year, there could be in the order of about $2 billion in gross royalty from other forms of economic rent. But for a province of 500,000 people, it's a pretty significant component, and as I mentioned, almost 25% of the total governmental revenue.
Thank you so much. This carbon pricing was implemented in 2019. For the benefit of the committee, are there specific cases where projects were delayed or scaled back due to the system?
I can't say specifically with respect to this particular component. I think I could say with some degree of confidence that the emissions cap policy probably bears more scrutiny with regards to particularly investment. I know at the exploration phase, as I think I've said before committee here in the past, that the investors didn't see that there was any opportunity for new projects so long as the emissions cap policy, as was discussed, was in place.
Since you brought that up, do you have some concerns around the Alberta MOU just based on that comment that you just had?
Yes, the fact that it's not been resolved, I should back up a little bit. I was very pleased to see that a grand bargain, so to speak, was struck, because in my mind, we struck one in 2019 when we adopted an analog for the carbon price regime here in the offshore. From what I understood, and I stood in front of roomfuls of 500 and 600 people in London and in Houston, I basically proudly proclaimed that our emissions cap concern was largely being alleviated by virtue of this MOU, as was communicated. Now I'm somewhat concerned that I don't see it formally resolved yet, and that still is lingering. So for Newfoundland and Labrador offshore, I'd say on a scale of magnitude, the emissions cap is far more harmful to investment than, for example, this carbon pricing mechanism.
Something else that was recently mentioned was carbon leakage. It was brought up earlier. And being that you are a person who is acutely in tune with the investment climate, especially around offshore development in Newfoundland and Labrador, I want to know what your thoughts are with respect to carbon leakage and the risk that we run of investment going to other jurisdictions that don't have as tight of policies.
So first and foremost, I think in terms of leakage, from a practical, physical way, and as a practical cross-jurisdictional perspective, they're both the same in terms of how our regime, I think, adequately protects ourselves from leakage, and particularly to the upstream emissions category. We look at each project on an individual basis, well, as we set our benchmarks, and we again provide for the particularities of those projects in a way that is meaningful for the operators to actively manage and reduce their carbons. So I think from in terms of leakage, from a financial or a geographical point of view, I think we're well managed by our system, and as a practical matter, in terms of even fugitive leakage and emissions, an offshore platform can't provide for it. We don't see it. We don't have it. It's monitored 24/7. And whether you're talking leakage practically or fiscally, I think our system is a robust one.
Talking about the production of oil going elsewhere.
Oh, the investment is clear to me that right now I mentioned that the upfront Guyana is attracting $60 billion worth of investment from international oil and gas companies within the last 5-year time frame, in which I said we had zero. Guyana had no active production in 2013 to 2015 when we were at our highest results from our license rounds. It has been a complete upside down.
We are Mr. Greaves online for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. My first question is for Madame Bruyette. Thank you very much for your testimony. I very much appreciated how you spoke to the fact that the design of Canada's industrial carbon price is often misunderstood and sometimes perhaps willfully misrepresented. I'm wondering if we could delve into one aspect of how output-based pricing operates in terms of providing funds back to the provinces of origin in order to fund decarbonization and green efforts. Could you speak to how important a funding stream that provides to municipalities and provinces as far as funding necessary investments in green and sustainable infrastructure?
So I think that the first piece here to mention is that it's a federal policy, and so there's a federal backstop, and so provinces decide if they either take on their own system and comply with that federal backstop, or implement it according to their own policy design and circumstances. I think the thing I'd like to mention here, though, is that the backstop here relies wholly on ministerial discretion, and it's unclear under which circumstances, if any, it's being implemented. And if we want to make sure that we're seeing this revenue being directed to green projects, but also alleviating consumer costs of energy as we're facing right now, that backstop being implemented more thoroughly and systematically would be very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Would it be fair to say, though, that this is an important source of funding for those provinces where and territories where the federal backstop does apply, that this is a valuable, necessary source of revenue for communities?
And I wish I had the numbers to tell you more about it, but I don't. Again, happy to submit that in writing.
Okay. No, thank you for that. Turning maybe to the global level, you spoke to this in your comments as well, Madame Bruyette, in terms of, what the potential implications for Canada are of missing the global market transition towards cleaner energy and lower emissions. In your view, is there another policy lever available to the federal government that could achieve the same scale of emissions reduction as output-based pricing?
I think the main policy tool that has been discussed is the emissions cap. The government has decided to move with the OBPS as the most potent tool for emissions reductions. This said, we need to make sure that, given unfortunately with the oil and gas emissions cap, the current industrial pricing system is made a lot more robust to be able to deliver reductions comparable to those resulting from existing weak systems and the cap, as well as ensuring that, industrial carbon pricing is not the only policy tool that we're deploying. Methane regulations are extremely important, especially for the oil and gas sector, and strong equivalency agreements with provinces who want their own regulations will also be really important.
Mm-hmm. I guess maybe to reframe that question, and I appreciate you pointing out the multiple tools and policies that the government has in effect to try to address Canada's emissions. Could you describe whether or not you think it would be a strategic risk for Canada in terms of achieving both our economic and environmental goals to move away from a national industrial carbon pricing system? What would be the risks to Canada or Canadian investments of not keeping this policy? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And further entrench us in a North American fossil fuel economy, which seems to be the desire of President Trump in terms of the geopolitics that are happening right now. Other countries, other jurisdictions in the world, as I said earlier, are moving very fast to adopt and accelerate their adoption of electric-based technology, and the war on Iran has increased that, whether we're looking at France, China, Korea, India, those are markets that account for a very large share of the global population, and we don't want to wake up in a couple of years and realize that we have invested in sectors that are not competitive in a net zero economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Thank you. 5 minutes.
We'll now go to Mr. Bonnet, 2.5 minutes. Madame Bruyette, we saw the government back up on a few issues concerning climate change. Do you think that Canada is right now on the right path in order to respect its climate engagements? The data is clear. We got the inventory, the national inventory that was published last week at the UN Committee on Climate Change, and it seems that progress has stopped, and these data go back to 2024. So this is the step back that you've mentioned. So these steps backs mean that it's unfortunately clear that we will not be able to meet our 2030 targets, and how will we meet those of 2035, and we have to get on line to get carbon neutrality or net zero by 2050. So the industrial tariffication for carbon, or would that help with these meeting these targets? Yes, but the government says it'll be the main tool that will be used to reduce Canadian greenhouse gases. So we have to make sure that this is done in a robust and credible way by 2030, 2035, and 2050. So in Alberta last fall, we saw the price of carbon credits go down, It even went down to $25 per ton. The federal government didn't do anything, didn't intervene to make sure that there was an equivalence that was sufficiently strong in Alberta. Do you think that this is acceptable? Would you like the government to come up with a true carbon tariffication program that would force recalcitrant province to put a minimum on their carbon credit? It's an important issue, especially when it comes to the shared jurisdiction there is. But right now, there is the federal is not making sure that there is a minimum of price for efficient industrial carbon pricing. So we have to make sure that the federal system be within regulation. And this is what some of our colleagues have suggested, like eco-justice. Provinces must believe that the federal government will implement the federal backstop if they do not meet the criteria set. And like we saw with Alberta, nothing happened. So under those circumstances, the federal policy in this case is totally inefficient. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Keating, for coming and being a witness for us. And we're in a different area here. We're at a crossroads here. And it's been quite a while since I've actually talked about this in terms of global trade and economics, the geopolitics. And Canada has the ambition of becoming an energy superpower, but not really mentioning how. Right now, we're celebrating the fact that there'll be more oil being sent to the United States in a pipeline, and we sell the majority of our oil already. But Energy Newfoundland and Labrador has said that the proposed oil and gas emissions cap would have chilling effect on investment decisions. Could you elaborate on how industrial carbon pricing and measures like emissions cap is affecting the economic investment outlook and long-term viability of offshore energy production in Newfoundland and Labrador? And just for a little bit of context, I have the same issue in Kitimat, BC, with a $40 billion LNG project, which is basically under the same umbrella, under the same conditions.
Yes, certainly. And again, I'm going to separate the two, although they are common in that there are climate-focused policies. The emissions cap is indeed the investment killer, as I've said this in a conference here last year, simply because, as was presented, when you model it, there is simply no room for any other project beyond the Beta Nor project, which was just advanced by the provincial government and the energy companies a few months ago. So it is a non-starter for the industry, and we just manage the decline of the existing fields, and that's not going to bring us to the realities of this current energy security-driven world by any stretch, and it would certainly show that Canada is not investable by any means. But the price on carbon is something that can be meaningful and can motivate and can drive more efficient and better performance and behavior amongst investors. My point in raising the Norwegian example is right now in the upstream, maybe 98% of the world's production is not subject to a direct carbon tax, as is in Norway. And that would include our humble offshore stuff as well as what you see in the UK and Australia. So that's a vast competitive gap. So my concern is, though, that if you're going to install a policy like this, which is meant to stoke a behavior of an investor, which I agree with fundamentally, you should also look at the front end and drive investment in those critical industries in which the world is screaming out for. Otherwise, if we fail in that, the investment and its emissions will simply go elsewhere.
Yes, thank you. And I agree. In fact, what's happening in BC right now with LNG Canada is that the lead proponent, Shell, is actually looking for a buyer for 3/4 of its stake in LNG Canada, $40 billion investment, the largest private investment in Canadian history. Mitsubishi is actually looking for buyers for its 15% stake. And both companies are saying it's to rebalance their risk profile, meaning Canada's too risky. There's a lot more jurisdictions that don't have these regulations and legislation in place, and they're going to do a lot better. I mean, look at Russia. They're selling more oil. They're selling more gas. I mean, Venezuela. I mean, it seems to me we're pricing ourselves out of this new geopolitics, the new geoenergy politics that we're facing. In fact, phase 2 of LNG Canada is still up in the air. We're not sure if it's Canada or if it's BC that are actually holding back phase 2 in terms of emissions or even carbon pricing for that matter. In the midst of all this, I assume you've got some type of approval process in place, maybe a preferred one. Is the Major Projects Office have got anything to do with the projects happening in Labrador and Newfoundland?
At this point, no, the Major Projects Office is not engaged in the Beta Nor project. Will it be in the future? I don't know. It's a decision of the proponents. But I think what's clear about that particular project, it will have an output of emissions between 6 to 10 kilograms per barrel, amongst the lowest in the world, inclusive of Norway. How can you deny these barrels and many more like it from Canada? And of course, natural gas on the West Coast, it's transition fuel. Why would we seek to burden and obstruct, delay, and obfuscate those great projects when as much as 20 or 25% of oil and gas is now being constrained in the Strait of Hormuz, for example? It makes no sense.
Thank you, Mr. Ross. And now, lastly, last round of questions, we'll go to Monsieur Saint-Pierre pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Very quick.
Thank you.
The industrial carbon price?
Yes, by multiple orders of magnitude.
Madame Brouillette, merci d'être ici, puis merci pour votre...
Madam Brouillette, thank you for being here, and thank you for your involvement. I think this is the second time you have appeared in front of this committee. Thank you very much for the work that you have done on behalf of Canadians and all of your members. I think that CANREC has about 200 member organizations. I think you said that. And you represent many, many Canadians. What have you heard in the field about carbon tariffication? Thank you. When it comes to the ceiling, the emissions cap has actually never been implemented in passing. So my members are saying that they're very impatient to see the carbon pricing and tariffication be looked at. We know that this is a very important issue during the elections, and it's been almost a year now that there hasn't been any progress. The oil and gas sector is has very rich and powerful lobbies, and they make the argument that any kind of imposition of anything is too much for them. So what we need is some firmness on the part of the government and to set up the system, because otherwise we are going to find ourselves really not within our path. Thank you. And I think my colleague also mentioned a letter that had been sent. Do you have any reports from CANREC or from the 200 members who are with you that could be sent to our committee for the study? Would it be possible for you to send us such reports? I'm going to make sure that we resubmit the letter that had been sent. We sent it as a foundational document for the committee, and in this letter, this puts forth our 5 recommendations to talk about industrial carbon pricing, to make sure that it's efficient and to make sure that we have long-term certainty, which is key to put us on the correct path of zero emissions. So CANREC is also present international. Can you tell us how many other countries have set up these sorts of systems in carbon tariffication? There are 14 individual countries as well as the EU in total who have set up systems that are comparable to industrial carbon tariffication. But there are many other countries where we see this system set up in a different way. For instance, Germany, Australia, Kazakhstan, Montenegro, Austria, just to name them. From a point of view of economy, their economies are doing fine. And in fact, most of the countries where we see the biggest economic growth, they have cap and trade systems, Indonesia and China and other places, Indonesia. We often feel that these economies are, in fact, we feel they might not be being able to, in fact, they are prospering, do you think? Well, generally speaking, there's a lot of empirical data to support this, but the policies are negligible in terms of economic impact. So not only do they not stop growth, they encourage growth. And we've seen this in Europe. There's this big study that was done in 2023 in a macroeconomic journal, and I'll say it in English.
Zero to modest positive impact.
Une dernière question.
So one last question. We often hear the Conservatives almost every single day in the House to say that industrial carbon price tariffication is going to mean higher prices at the grocery store. Can you give us 30 seconds about this issue and the price of food and other essentials? Like I said in my speech, there's very little of that industrial cost that would be passed on to the consumer. The Institute on Tariffication looked at this and what would be the effect on the average household. So $170 a ton, and the impact on the consumer would be equivalent. Of course, it depends because it's an average, but it would be like a 0.1% reduction in consumers.
For their time today. Merci, Madame Brouillette. Thank you very much, Mr. Keating.
Madam.
Go. We will suspend briefly while we switch over and get our next set of witnesses. Thank you. study of industrial carbon pricing. Welcome, witnesses. Thank you so much for coming to spend some time with us this afternoon. We have 3 witnesses for this hour. We have Jennifer Winter, professor from University of Calgary, online. We have Adam Auer, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Cement Association of Canada, here with us in person. And we have Thomas Green, Senior Manager of Climate Solutions with the David Suzuki Foundation, online. Welcome, welcome. You will each have 5 minutes to present your opening statements, and then we will go to questions by committee members. And we will start with Ms. Winter for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to appear before the committee on this very important issue. It is a privilege to speak to you today. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and my comments are based on my expertise as a researcher on carbon pricing issues and climate policy design. Canada faces a challenge in reducing emissions and simultaneously protecting the quality of life and economic growth that we enjoy. Adaptation to and mitigation of climate change is a complex problem, and addressing it deserves careful evaluation of policy options. We are also facing unprecedented global uncertainty and numerous economic shocks, which place new constraints on feasible policy actions. My comments today reflect both my support for emissions reductions and my desire to see careful climate policy design that maximizes benefits and minimizes costs to Canadians. I will make 2 points today. First, Canada's existing industrial emissions pricing systems, the federal OBPS and those put in place by provincial and territorial governments, are designed to incentivize emissions reductions and protect competitiveness. The systems achieve these 2 objectives by pricing emissions, an economic bad, and subsidizing output, an economic good. Subsidizing output reduces the cost of compliance for regulated firms and maintains domestic and international competitiveness. All of these systems are designed to increase in stringency over time as the need to protect competitiveness decreases with more global action to reduce emissions. An additional benefit of protecting competitiveness is that it also mitigates the cost effects on households and businesses. My research and that of my colleagues Trevor Toome and Kent Fellows, among others, demonstrates the overall effect of emissions pricing on the economy is small. For example, at $80 per ton, the average increase in food prices from the federal OBPS is 0.5%. Importantly, a consequence of protecting competitiveness is that Canada's emissions are higher compared to an alternative policy that does not offer that protection, such as a full carbon tax. Second, these systems can and should be improved in response to domestic and international changes. Canada's decentralized federation and shared federal-provincial jurisdiction over the environment means flexibility in design for provinces and territories. While flexibility allows for policy experimentation and customization for each jurisdiction's unique economic context, it also has negative consequences. The 10 different systems differ in share of emissions priced, thresholds for when facilities are subject to pricing, performance standard for regulated facilities, and the time path of stringency increases, just to name a few key differences. One important consequence of this flexibility is different emissions credit prices across Canada, which matters for more than just fairness. Differential treatment of a specific sector or facility reallocates capital and labor throughout the economy, moving these production inputs away from their most productive use. This artificially expands some sectors and shrinks others and lowers Canada's productivity. Differential emissions prices, either implicit or explicit, in different sectors results in some firms engaging in more costly emissions reductions than would otherwise be the case. The consequence is more costly emissions reductions overall, increasing the cost of meeting Canada's targets. Another way to think about this issue is that differential system design and price levels are a barrier to internal trade. This impedes economic growth and reduces productivity. An important opportunity for improvement is working to harmonize markets and harmonize the policy environment, reducing the total cost of emissions reductions and reducing the total cost of addressing climate change. This requires cooperation across Canada. Federal action alone is insufficient. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. Winter, we will now go to Mr. Auer for 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear. My name is Adam Auer. I'm the President and CEO of the Cement Association of Canada. Our 6 members operate 14 cement plants across 5 provinces, supporting more than 62,000 direct and indirect jobs and contributing $5.1 billion to Canadian wages and salaries in 2024 alone. Canada's cement industry has been clear and transparent since we began this journey over a decade ago. We support well-designed industrial carbon pricing. Despite the current economic headwinds facing our industry and the country, our position has not changed. We continue to believe that industrial carbon pricing, when thoughtfully designed and implemented, can attract investment, support competitiveness, and accelerate the cement and concrete industry's decarbonization. Cement manufacturing accounts for approximately 7 to 8% of global CO2 emissions and about 1.5% of Canada's. Decarbonizing our sector matters, and our member companies take that responsibility seriously. Cement is also among the most trade-exposed sectors in the economy. If industrial carbon pricing is done wrong, it will shift Canadian cement production to lower-cost, higher-carbon jurisdictions, which threatens Canadian jobs, communities, and our businesses, as well as our climate reduction goals. This means we need carbon pricing to do the job it was intended to do, drive investment toward cutting emissions, and support the transition to an economy that values increasingly lower carbon goods and services. There's a global reconciliation of cement manufacturing capacity underway right now. Aging plants will be modernized or closed, and new investment will flow to the jurisdictions that present the strongest business case. A predictable, well-calibrated industrial carbon pricing policy is a central component of that business case. Fundamentally, decarbonization is modernization and productivity improvement by another name. Fuel switching, clinker substitution, thermal heat recovery, these investments make plants more efficient, more competitive, and less emission-intensive all at once. But these projects sit at the margin of investability. The engineering confirms that the projects are viable, but the business case is lacking. Payback periods are long, and demand-side signals for new products are not yet strong enough to close that gap. Carbon pricing is a bridge, a necessary component of closing that gap to make these projects investable today rather than a decade from now. In a global reconciliation where capital decisions are being made now, timing is the difference between Canada winning or losing that investment. But our support for industrial carbon pricing does not mean that the current system is working. It is not. Our members operate under 5 different provincial pricing regimes, each with their own rules and regulations. For example, in British Columbia, stringency is so high we've lost market share to imports. In Alberta, tier credits trade far below the regulated price, undermining the investment signal that should be driving carbon capture and other decarbonization projects. This fragmentation is an interprovincial trade barrier that undermines the very investor confidence the system is meant to build. It must be addressed through greater market integration and ultimately a harmonized national market capable of linking with international systems like the Western Climate Initiative and the European Union's emissions trading system. Canada's cement industry is not here to ask you to weaken industrial carbon pricing. We're here to ask you to fix it so that it works as intended. The moment calls for it, and that opportunity is grounded in national interest. Cement and concrete are as strategic to Canada's economy as energy. There is no housing, no infrastructure, no defence project, no renewable energy installation, no trade corridor that does not depend on a secure domestic supply of cement. Maintaining a competitive, modern, and increasingly clean supply is not simply good industrial policy, it's a matter of economic sovereignty. If we get the policy conditions right, we can ensure that investment drives demand for lower carbon concrete and accelerates the modernization of the plants that produce it, aligning Canada's economic and infrastructure agenda with its climate objectives at the same time. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auer. We will now go to Mr. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Green, Senior Manager, Climate Solutions. I've been at the David Suzuki Foundation for 8 years, and I've been working on carbon pricing since the very beginning. DSF was one of the environmental organizations signing on to the letter to the Prime Minister that was sent in March, and we've sent the committee also a more detailed written submission. Canada's climate policy toolkit has been depleted. We've lost the carbon levy, the consumer carbon levy, the oil and gas emissions cap. The electric vehicle availability standard is going to be replaced with yet to be drafted tailpipe standards. So what is left is a powerful lever for industrial carbon pricing, and it's really important to get it right. Le gouvernement a à juste titre placé la
The government has rightly placed climate competitiveness at the heart of Canada's economic strategy, and this strategy depends on robust, predictable, and workable carbon pricing for industry.
Is supported by leading economists. There was a letter recently with 200 economists supporting continuing with industrial carbon pricing. We're very concerned that the Alberta MOU and how it's implemented risks undermining industrial carbon pricing. Indeed, a week after the MOU was signed, Alberta weakened its system further with regulatory changes that flood the market with credits, and prices predictably collapsed. So why does carbon pricing matter beyond climate? It's a competitiveness policy. As the EU carbon border adjustment policy takes effect, global markets are increasingly pricing carbon intensity into trade and investment decisions. A June 2025 survey of industrial carbon participants showed that it is working to reduce emissions in Canada to support business performance, to advance low carbon investments, yet confidence was lacking that the price will reach $170 by 2030. And I think that's in part because we see a lot of pressure from both from industry and from some across the political spectrum to weaken it or get rid of it entirely. The question is not whether Canada can afford robust industrial carbon pricing. It's whether Canada can afford to be caught without it when trading partners come looking at the carbon content of our exports. The Canadian Climate Institute showed that $57 billion in decarbonization projects are linked to the carbon price signal. That's real investment in job and government revenues that are at stake. On actual costs, you've heard referenced before the CCI study showing that oil sands compliance costs are about 9 cents per barrel today, rising to 50 cents by 2030. That's hardly a competitiveness risk. We've also heard reference to the Fraser Institute's flawed findings, and we caution the committee from basing its recommendations on a model that hasn't been validated and doesn't do an adequate job modeling how industrial carbon pricing works. It's an outlier, and sectors with little or no industrial carbon pricing appear in the Fraser Institute's analysis to have the largest model impacts, which shows that it's not working properly. It doesn't price how industrial carbon pricing protects competitiveness, and industry reacts by investing in decarbonization. And New Economy Canada's VP of Government Relations had a supportive statement on carbon pricing when the budget came out, saying the newly announced climate competitiveness strategy sends the right signal on the importance of industrial pricing for global competitiveness. At the same time, businesses need certainty as possible, as soon as possible, to unlock investment. So the task for the government and our core ask is to ensure the 2026 review results in a robust system, which includes a strong and rising and enforced minimum industrial carbon price, a clear and credible post-2030 industrial price trajectory, restoring a level playing field across jurisdictions, and a few other elements like this. Les économistes appuient la tarification du carbone.
Economists are in favor of support industrial carbon pricing. The World Bank recognizes it as a powerful tool that drives efficiency and innovation.
And act accordingly with these recommendations. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Green. We will now move to questions by committee members, and we'll begin with Mr. Bexty for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just getting my stopwatch going here. It's like, turn it on, don't shut it off. Welcome, witnesses. I really appreciate your presence here today. Hope to benefit from your knowledge and help us make good decisions. Dr. Winter, if I could start with you. if investors hate uncertainty, as you've said, why should industry trust a system where the rules keep changing?
That is a great question. And we are in unprecedented times of uncertainty. Some of this is beyond our control. I'm speaking to like geopolitical events. What we can control in Canada is the choices of governments. And one thing that governments can do to reduce uncertainty and maintain confidence is implement set review periods. And this is something that the Government of Canada has done, and provinces and territories implementing their own systems, in that the rules of the game are set for a certain amount of time, and then there is a review period to evaluate the effectiveness, the stringency, whether or not the systems are doing the right job. And within that review period, it leads to change. Yeah.
I'm going to go quick because I have limited time, so I appreciate it, though. You've also expressed dissatisfaction with the carbon credit system. You've agreed that inconsistent pricing signals undermine efficiency and competitiveness and causes confusion in industry. That's not good. Based off all that, are we underestimating the cumulative economic impact of the policy situation we're in today and going forward?
You know, that is a great question. I haven't done the modeling myself, and so I wouldn't want to mislead you. So I think I'll defer and follow up with a written statement.
Or something you mentioned in your opening statement, and it relates to how predictable the current circumstances we're right now. You know, I've been in industry for a long time, politics for a very short time, but I remember a number of geopolitical upheavals over the last 4 years, and they happened on like 10-year intervals. Wasn't this predictable where we're in right now? I mean, maybe not the magnitude of it, but and how should that be incorporated in economic models? You know, the uncertainty related to big upheavals like the Persian Gulf circumstance, that should be part of our planning, no?
I think it is difficult to plan for unexpected shocks by their nature, though I will say the existing carbon pricing design, by subsidizing output, does protect competitiveness, and that also buffers the regulated firms against the shocks they face.
I would suggest that we need to be a little bit more robust in how we risk things, because we know an oil price shock is going to come every 10 years, and then it abates. And then another one comes again and it abates. But thank you very much. If I can move to Mr. Auer on the cement industry, it's another industry that I like a lot and I spend a lot of time in. At what point does carbon pricing begin to create carbon leakage rather than emissions reductions?
Yeah, excellent question. Carbon leakage is our number one concern, obviously, with the design of any carbon pricing system. And really, it goes back to the question of calibration. And so, effectively, if the compliance costs become so great that it creates,
of how high
I
that
can't
is?
give you a dollar figure of, you know, because
higher than it is now, or is it happening now?
Well, the design of the system that we have now in most provinces is such that it is protective against those leakage concerns. As I mentioned in my remarks, we have experienced leakage in British Columbia, in particular in the previous system, which was a direct carbon tax, not an output-based pricing system.
So that's kind of evidence that we're close, that we're at the point where
Under the old system, British Columbia has since transitioned to an output-based pricing system, which offers some level of protection, although it still remains significantly more stringent than other provinces.
So if cement is a core input in housing and infrastructure, how much do rising carbon prices add to the typical housing unit or a major infrastructure project?
For cement, they don't. That is the point of an EIT design, is because the market will not absorb those additional costs.
So how much of the Canadian production?
Sorry, Mr. Bexty, your time is up.
Did I have 6 or 5?
Oh, I apologize. You have another minute.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate it. A minute and 10 seconds because of the.
And you have another 15 because I just interrupted you. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. What percentage of Canada's production, like plant and infrastructure for cement manufacture, is at risk of obsolescence? Like how close to the end of its normal economic life?
I would not say that there are any plants that are in imminent danger of closure at this moment. But as I mentioned in the remarks, there is global reconciliation undergoing. Essentially, the world has an oversupply of cement. And so we will see, in particular, because decarbonization investments, as I mentioned, are productivity improvement. So you'll see some plants that are able to produce more cement more efficiently, and that's going to increase pressure.
I remember a couple shocks where a great deal of production from Russia and China, as the current crisis abates, will flood the markets, right? And that I see as being a major risk upheaval for the Canadian cement manufacturing industry. And the carbon pricing is just going to make that worse, right? So appreciate your comments. Thank you. My time's up.
Next up, we have Monsieur Saint-Pierre pour 6 minutes, pas 5 minutes.
For 6 minutes, not 5 minutes, but 6 minutes. Thank you for the 6 minutes. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question in French, if you don't mind, Mr. Green. Why is carbon pricing for the large issuer is considered as a policy that is efficient in Canada? Why would it be a climate policy that is the best in Canada? Thank you for the issue. It is because the industrial carbon pricing system, okay, first of all, we have to understand that the industrial sector in Canada is pretty important. So it represents a large proportion of the emissions, but it is also a very efficient tool because the design is such that it's not that the price is on the emission, not all the emissions, but it is pricing on the production, so the output. So for companies that are below that level, in fact, they're going to be able to make money because they can sell their credits to other businesses in the same industry that are more polluters. So the design is very well done. It doesn't infringe on industrial competitivity, but it also allows for trading. Quickly, is industrial carbon pricing, does it resolve issues in some sectors that are emitting more than others? It depends on the various systems in the various provinces. For a sector like cement that we were just talking about, there is a very high level of emissions that are not subject to a price. So it is really based on the sector. For oil and gas, it is very important to ensure that there is proper pricing on this sector because they do represent 30% of the national emissions. And there is a sector, there's been no progress whatsoever up to date. Thank you very much.
Or Clean 50 award in the background. I'm also Clean 50 award recipient, so I just want to do a secret handshake there. I'm getting text from my colleague Corey Hogan from Calgary Confed saying hello. So I'll digress, but over the last few years, you've written many reports on industrial carbon pricing and its impact on the economy. There's two in particular. I think in 2021, you wrote one called Carbon Pricing Costs for Households and the Progressivity of Revenue Recycling Options in Canada. And then in 2024, another report called Does Emissions Pricing Hurt Affordability? ? Quantifying the effects on Canadian households. Can you provide copies of those two reports to the ENVI committee and any other reports that you might find pertinent? And then can you very quickly summarize those reports, those findings in less than a minute?
Yes, absolutely. The basic premise of the federal fuel charge, which was the carbon tax on households and small businesses, was to charge for emissions and then use the revenue through a lump sum transfers in the tax system to reduce the overall effect. And so that substantially minimized the cost on households. And for many households, the revenue that they received was actually greater than their expected carbon tax burden. And that combined with the OBPS, which, as I mentioned, also dampens the effects on households and businesses, means that the overall effect on prices from food to other consumer goods was less than 1%.
Would you say that the Cement Association of Canada fully supports the industrial carbon price?
I mean, with I would say a well-designed and well-calibrated carbon price, yes.
And can you unpack why your association and many of your members support the industrial carbon price or a well-designed industrial carbon pricing system?
Yeah, I think the main driver is that we are a large emitter of emissions globally. That means that there is some pressure on the sector, both from governments and from investors, to find solutions to that footprint. Obviously, we're an essential material that, in particular in the conversation in Canada right now about building out big infrastructure, is got a role to play in making sure that infrastructure is not only well built and durable and resilient to the climate, but also low carbon. But I think the broader context is really about this global reconciliation piece, that modernization of our industry is effectively decarbonization. It's improving efficiency, improving competitiveness, investing in technologies that are overall good for the business, but where the market signal is just not there yet, right? And so it's these government interventions like carbon pricing that is making the difference in terms of decisions of where capital is flowing for modernization. And we see carbon pricing as one of the tools. There are other elements around that tool, revenue recycling, investment tax credits that we can talk about if you like, but it's one of the tools that ensures that Canada remains a destination for that modernization capital.
Monsieur Saint-Pierre. Maintenant, Monsieur Bonin pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Bonin for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Green, do you have other examples of countries who produce oil and gas and that put in place industrial carbon pricing that would be considered ambitious and functional? I think that the best way to respond to this question is to refer you to the study of the World Bank on the carbon pricing system in the world, and I could absolutely send you a summary of the information that is relevant in this regard. But what we can see,
Ça me fait beaucoup de plaisir de...
I am very pleased to hear a representative from the industry of cement that recognize that the industrial carbon prices can help with decarbonization. It's too bad that we don't have the same attitude in the oil and gas sector. I mean, they have absurd profits, and yet they are resisting. They resist this tool that would really help with decarbonization. And maybe, Mr. Orr, is your association, do they have a perspective on the adjustment of the carbon pricing at the border, which was a proposal that we found in the election platform of the government? Are you in favor of this kind of initiative like Europe put in place?
Désolé que je ne peux pas répondre.
First of all, I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer completely in French.
Sectors that is subject to the carbon border adjustment in Europe, and so we have been, I think, offered qualified support for the introduction of that measure as a tool that Europe plans to use to reduce the amount of protection that currently exists under the trading system. I think it's fair to say that we think it's a promising tool. Obviously, the geopolitics or the economics in Canada are slightly different, given our deeply integrated economy with the United States. But in principle, we see it as a potentially valuable tool in providing carbon leakage protection.
Merci. Monsieur Green, merci.
Thank you. Mr. Green, thank you for your recommendation. One of those recommendations was talking about a price post 2030 and a trajectory. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about the social price of carbon past to 2030? Yes, certainly. We see that climate change is starting to do a lot of damages. We've got flooding and wildfires, as well as all the effects on health. There are risks for the future. So the carbon pricing.
Le coût social du carbone est beaucoup plus.
The social cost of carbon is much higher than the carbon is right now priced in this carbon pricing system. And we would like those two prices to get a bit closer to each other. We want the carbon pricing to actually increase faster with so that it can align better to the social cost of carbon, because this is the price that carbon brings into the environment. You are also talking about having comparable game rules across jurisdiction. Is it the case if we talk about Alberta with the credits that are very cheap and a system like Quebec? Do you think they're equivalent? And how do you think how do you think we can make sure that they are? At the present time, the federal government is not taking action when the provinces are weakening their systems. For example, Saskatchewan completely stopped industrial carbon prices. Alberta froze it at 95 per ton, and then made some changes so that the credits would be so inflated that the price collapsed. There is a lack of action by the federal government, and that is not good for competitivity, for investments. There is also a matter of fairness and of efficiency of the system. So there's a risk, for example, that if there isn't carbon pricing, or if it's weakened in other provinces, that a province like Quebec, for example, could be subjected to bad consequences and would be at a disadvantage. I wouldn't say it is disadvantage, because we can see right now that we have a crisis in the Gulf. The fact of decarbonizing is actually helping companies in the long term, because there is less waste of the carbon, and also less energy waste. We see that with the electrification, we are changing dirty technologies and changing them for cleaner and more efficient technologies. So this is an advantage, economically speaking. And you're saying that there shouldn't be, or there should be very little offset. I think it's offset credits. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about those offsets? We are afraid that those offsets, they don't really represent a decrease in emissions. They're credits just based on paper. They have no value. And in the end, they're going to decrease the price that are actually could lead to decarbonization. So we're afraid of a system becoming weaker.
We will now go to Mr. Leslie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll start with Mr. Auer. You mentioned a couple times, I think, the words thoughtfully crafted, well-designed when trying to describe what would be an effective industrial carbon tax. Is this one thoughtfully or well-designed?
I think we believe that the original design of the federal backstop and the output pricing system was well calibrated to address carbon leakage and competitiveness concerns. But now we are existing in a world where there are significant differences in how that, I guess the equivalency of systems that the provinces have adopted that are I would say, creating some lack of fairness across the different systems and lack of flexibility with lost opportunities, I think, for the kind of integration that would provide the predictability and stability that is core to the function of these markets in the long term. And when the backstop was initially implemented, there was, I think, a sense of confidence and visibility in terms of where it was going in the longer term, and I can't say that that's currently the case.
You wrote a letter alongside a number of fuel association, gas association, propane association, steel producers, chemistry, fertilizer, forest, mining, so a pretty big gauntlet. A lot of associations, a pretty gently worded letter, but combined with kind of what you just described, is it fair to assume that as a sector, as multiple sectors, you don't feel like there's the necessary consultations happening right now to make the adjustments that are going to be adequate to protect that competitiveness and prevent that carbon leakage?
The main point of that letter was in response to a consultation on benchmarks and stringency going forward, and it was the collective consensus of the industries involved in that letter that that was not the right place to start a conversation about the evolution of the system, that there were more fundamental issues with the system that should be addressed first. Not that the system itself was was opposed by the sectors, simply the starting point for a conversation on where the system was going.
In that letter, you talked about how the world has changed and investment decisions are changing with it. What is it that the Liberals are not understanding that should be addressed, as you just outlined, that needs to be addressed before any changes are made to enhance or strengthen or make more expensive the system?
When the initial output-based pricing system was crafted, there was a fairly significant competitiveness risk analysis process that every sector underwent, and sectors were ranked by their level of exposure, and then, as was mentioned in other remarks, the percentage of emissions that were subject to the carbon price were then determined based on, or calibrated based on, the level of risk. We believe that before we get into a conversation about changing benchmarks and other stringency measures, that another competitiveness review should be completed.
So what happens? So the proposed or floated idea here is those companies that are under 25,000 tons are not currently impacted, but they're over 10,000, so they may soon be impacted. What sort of, they're dealing with high prices of everything, just like every other Canadian, higher payrolls, higher costs of equipment and compliance. So what happens when that threshold gets lowered and a whole bunch of them get grouped into this? What is that going to do for those specific smaller companies, and what impact is that going to have on the price of all of the products that ultimately we use in our municipal infrastructure, housing, and everything else?
I can really only speak for the cement sector. I can't really speak for other sectors on what the impacts might be for those industries.
Cement producer, you're not subject to it because the threshold is above what your emissions are. If they lower that stringency, you're going to enter that space. It's going to have
you're talking about the
business.
benchmark, not the threshold for being captured by the system.
Yes.
Well, that's what the competitiveness analysis is meant to determine. What is the appropriate benchmark for each sector covered under the system to ensure that those price impacts are not acute.
You also mentioned the flexibility to be maintained for provinces. It seems as though that is kind of being further and further restricted. What flexibility is still left to be maintained in your view?
Well, that is to be determined, I think. At the moment, I think the provinces have all, developed their own systems that are, again, calibrated to the particular sectors that they find in their provinces, and then the evolution of the next system will determine how much of that flexibility will be preserved. We believe that there should be some flexibility preserved.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leslie. We'll now turn to Mr. Fanjoy for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to note, as this is the Environment and Sustainable Development Committee that tomorrow is Earth Day, and Canadians are counting on us to do good work here. I'd also like to point out that all across the country, nature is applying its own carbon price. Right now, I have sandbagging happening in my riding. As I look around to my colleagues here, I can think of incidents in most, if not all, of our ridings where we have seen nature's carbon price wreak havoc on our communities. What we're talking about with an industrial carbon price is a thoughtful approach to address the problem of rising emissions that is wreaking havoc on our climate. And I don't take, and I appreciate every member here who doesn't take that responsibility lightly. My colleague, Mr. Bexley, was speaking about regular repeating pattern of geopolitical upheavals, and he's quite right that these happen with great regularity. My question is to you, Dr. Winter. Do these geopolitical upheavals impact clean and renewable energy?
Absolutely. I think any global disturbance will impact both renewables, say through supply chains for the demand for these renewables, and it also affects your more traditional energy sectors, oil and gas, nuclear. It's sort of beyond my expertise to quantify that for you, but the extent to which these upheavals affect these sectors will really depend on how tied they are into the global economy.
I know that that electricity, particularly from solar, wind, hydro, is not being held up in the Strait of Hormuz. What is it going to take? And perhaps I'll address this question to Mr. Green. For more Canadians to take advantage of the solutions that are available to them and help them deal with the affordability crisis that geopolitical upheavals cause. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, at the Foundation, we've been working hard to strengthen the east-west grid across Canada. We think the federal government should be investing in that. We should be adding more renewables to the grid. We should be supporting Canadian households to electrify, to replace furnaces with heat pumps. We should be doing that to replace, more public transit that's electrified or EVs on the road. All those switches mean we get off the roller coaster of fossil fuels and the kind of inflation that causes, and we're better positioned for when the next crisis happens. So I noticed in the last panel there was a discussion about there not being investment in certain oil and gas projects. Well, one of the reasons there's a lack of investment in some of these projects is that the world is moving so quickly to renewables. Batteries have come down in cost, solar, wind have come down in cost. It doesn't make sense to invest in a lot of more fossil fuel supply when, as you point out, your constituents are responding to floods, or other people are facing or will face this summer wildfires. I mean, this makes much more sense to try and reduce how much we produce, export, and use fossil fuels, and to electrify our economy.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Auer, I'd like to turn to you. You've mentioned that the cement and concrete is responsible for fairly large emissions. Can you briefly tell us what the industry is doing to the innovations that they're pursuing to reduce that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. The lowest hanging fruit in our sector has to do basically with two strategies. And I should point out that we actually have a roadmap for decarbonization that's been published for a number of years now. And if you want to dig into the details, you can look in there. But basically, fuel substitution to lower carbon alternatives, clinker substitution, which means new cement recipes that reduce the most carbon-intensive ingredients in the formulation, and then ongoing sort of more traditional process and efficiency improvements. In the longer term, it's carbon capture technology that will be required to get us into the deep reduction territory.
Thank you very much.
Quickly, Madam Chair, could we have that roadmap
yes.
provided to the committee? Thank you.
Excellent. Et maintenant, Monsieur Bonin pour 2.5 minutes.
And now, Mr. Bonin for 2.5 minutes.
Vous avez parlé.
Ms. Winter, you spoke about the negative effect on productivity of having too big of a difference between carbon pricing from one province to another. In your opinion, is it disadvantageous for Quebec if it maintains its system and if it doesn't adhere to the federal backstop for an industrial carbon pricing in other provinces? Economically speaking, could this cause problems?
Thank you for the question. No, I do not believe it would be disadvantageous for Quebec to maintain its cap and trade system. The federal backstop and a federal benchmark allows for flexibility amongst provinces, and Quebec, the benefit of Quebec's system is quantity certainty with the cap and trade system. And so relative to the rest of Canada, Quebec has more certainty on its emissions reduction path. The other provinces and territories have chosen price certainty rather than quantity certainty.
I'm sorry, I need to clarify my question. Perhaps you didn't understand it. Quebec has its system in place. If Canada doesn't maintain the system in place, an equivalent one, for businesses in Quebec, could this be a disadvantage, having a price in Quebec that doesn't exist elsewhere?
Yes. So, yes, technically speaking, if Quebec was the only province with emissions pricing, then it would be a higher cost jurisdiction relative to the other provinces and territories. It could, of course, mitigate this through free allocations of emissions permits, which would protect competitiveness both within Quebec from imports of other goods and Quebec exporters.
And Mr. Orr, you spoke about the importance of having up-to-date analyses in terms of exposure in different sectors. When was the last time that this kind of analysis was done federally?
With the original output-based pricing launch in 2019, I guess it would have been, or 18. Yeah.
Et est-ce que vous avez, probablement pour votre industrie...
And probably for your industry and for all sectors, well, do we have the number of free allocations provided through the systems that exist in Canada? For example, in Quebec, it's 99% for large emitters in terms of free allocations, depending on the sector. But is this information available, and could you share it with us?
Certainly would be willing to share it. The short answer is every province has its own benchmark, but the federal backstop for cement, we're in the highest category. 95% of the emissions above the benchmark are covered.
Merci, Monsieur Bonin. We'll now go to Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Bonin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Winter, thank you for your testimony. And I do like the conversation we're having here, because we're trying to have a thoughtful discussion of consequences and trade-offs. And I was an MLA in the BC legislature for a few years and was quite shocked when the Business Council of BC did an analysis of Clean BC's plan. A lot of mayors across BC were also shocked when the BC took the BC government's numbers and facts and basically compiled it to show that the cumulative economic loss to BC would be 109 to 132 billion over 10 years. Are you aware of that analysis? And did you agree with the thought process that went into it?
I have not seen that analysis, so I'm sorry. If I could briefly comment on I think my impression is that it's quite possible it is accurate, but it does lack the other side of the coin in that by continuing to emit, there are climate damages.
If you haven't read it, then I'll wait until you read it and then maybe give me a thorough analysis of what you think of it. The BC government basically tried to downplay it in saying that the Business Council of BC, the biggest business advocate in BC, didn't know what they were talking about, even though the author just took it from all the graphs and all the numbers and compiled it, and he had to dig for it in all the government internet pages. He had to dig for it, and that's what came out. They didn't deny it, but also in that same report, the BCBC actually predicted that annual household income would decline by $11,000 annually. So when we're talking about the consequences and trade-offs, I like not to forget the human element. So have you done an analysis of all these policies, whether it be nationally or provincially, in terms of the impact on the household of the individual and the average Canadian individual?
My work on household impacts has been limited to carbon pricing. I do have work that enumerates Canadian emissions mitigation policies, and we have ongoing work to evaluate the combined impact of those policies.
Something else. I actually go by the Business Council of BC's analysis that the BC government hasn't denied. In that context, when we're talking about the consequences and trade-offs, I'm looking at your bio, by the way. I've yet to come across anybody in terms of the EV mandate talking about the impact to the land and the water. We're all geared toward the emissions, which is good, especially when we're talking about Canada's commitment to it. But nobody seems to talk about what this means to the land base, whether we're talking about Canada, whether we're talking about South Africa, whether we're talking about different regions around the world that still use forced or slave labor or don't have worker standards or environmental standards. So has your office actually looked into these consequences or trade-offs?
I have done some work on project-specific analysis of consequences and trade-offs. For example, coal mining in Alberta, partial upgrading facilities, fairly similar to what the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada does in evaluating the benefits and burdens. No, not internationally.
Of child labor in Africa, for instance. We've heard about Uyghurs' treatment in China. And this is relevant because the EV mandate actually has this Liberal government actually bringing in 49,000 electric vehicles from a country that's reported to have human rights issues. So I think if we're going to have this thoughtful discussion on consequences, trade-offs, it's got to include everything, including the supply chain. Would you agree with that comment?
I would say in part. For me, it depends on forgive me for being a bit academic, but the reference group that you care about. And if it's Canada, then we would exclude other countries. But if not, then yes, including other human rights issues.
And for the last set of questions, we'll go to Mr. Grant for 5 minutes.
Thanks, witnesses. I'll start with you, Dr. Winter, and just want to talk in a context where the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism is now fully entering its definitive phase, and where Canadian exporters in sectors like steel and aluminum face potential border carbon charges. Is there a credible argument that having a robust, well-enforced OPPS actually protects those industries from double exposure, and is a strong domestic carbon price an asset rather than a liability in that trading environment?
I'm not sure about the double exposure, but I will comment that the border adjustment does account for emissions pricing in other countries. And so Canadian firms would just pay the difference between the headline rate in Canada and the EU's headline carbon price. And so the OBPS does provide, call it protection. The alternative would be, say in this counterfactual world where Canada did not have industrial emissions pricing, then Canadian firms would face the full brunt of the EU CBAM, and the revenues would also go to the EU rather than be used within Canada.
As I understand, cement is a hard-to-abate sector, where the chemistry of making cement itself accounts for the majority of emissions, meaning efficiency improvements and fuel switching can only take you so far, and that CCUS is ultimately a valuable tool. In that context, how essential is a stable long-term carbon price trajectory paired with the existence of investment tax credits?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, carbon capture and storage is sort of the technology of last resort in some ways. I mean, there are companies, including a Canadian company, Heidelberg, in its facility in Edmonton, that are actively exploring full-scale carbon capture. So the technology is a real conversation in Canada, and there are active capture systems in other jurisdictions around the world on cement facilities. The business case for carbon pricing is the furthest away of any of the solutions, I would say, in our sector. And so an ecosystem of pricing, credits, and other forms of financing support, contracts for difference, for example, are absolutely essential to getting those technologies off the ground.
Just to follow up, would you say uncertainty regarding carbon pricing, say if industrial carbon pricing was not on the table, would that be a major barrier to the achievement of a net zero cement sector?
From where we sit today, yes. Yeah, the uncertainty that we've experienced in the past number of years has already stalled projects.
Thank you. Back to you, Dr. Winter. The Canadian Climate Institute found that approximately $4.3 billion in annual clean energy investment is linked directly to the existence of industrial carbon pricing systems. Does your own research support the view that pricing certainty is what enables companies to make the business case for large clean energy technology and capital expenditures?
I would say it's two components. One is pricing certainty, so that they have the time path of expected policy and expected revenue from, say, selling credits. And then I think the other part of it, which is also important, is the price level, in that the incentive provided by $95 a ton is very different than the incentive provided by a price of $5 a ton.
Conversely, what does the economic literature suggest happens to that investment if the price signal becomes uncertain or is removed?
If a price signal is uncertain or removed, then there is limited or no investment in low carbon technologies or emissions reduction technologies or investments at existing firms, because the impetus and the requirement has been eliminated.
Okay, quickly, what sectors of the Canadian economy stand to benefit most from a strong, stable industrial carbon price over the next decade?
I would say any sector that is low emissions or a technology that relies on the existence of pricing to for its revenue stream. For example, carbon capture and storage or direct air capture.
Thank all of the witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday at 11, where we're going to do our final 2 hours of this study. I wish you all a very happy Earth Day. Bonne journée de la Terre, est-ce qu'on dit en français? Bonjour de la Terre. For those who celebrate. Meeting adjourned.